Hello and welcome to another video. Today's topic is the coal mines of Ukraine's Donbas region. This area of land has quite extensive history, interesting places, and unfortunately, centuries of bloodshed. To start, what is Donbas? Well, the word Donbas is shorthand for Donetsk Basin, or Donetsk Coal Basin, and the region itself is mostly flat plains with a maximum elevation of 369 meters along the Donetsk Ridge. The land itself is rich in minerals, and beneath the surface are massive deposits of coal, salt, limestone, and clay. The northern sector of the Donbas also holds some natural gas deposits as well. The Donbas region was home to a number of ancient cultures and civilizations, including the Scythians, Tatars, Kipchaks, and a few others. The Scythians, in particular, were a nomadic people who dominated the area in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. They were known for their skill in horseback riding and archery, and their culture had significant influence on the region. In the Middle Ages, the Donbas region was part of the Kievan Rus state, which was one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe at the time. The region was also home to a number of nomadic tribes, including the Pechenegs and the Cumans. In the 17th and 18th century, the Donbas region became part of the Russian Empire, and it was during this period that the region's coal mining industry began to develop. The industry grew rapidly during the 19th century, and the Donbas region became one of the most important industrial centers in the Russian Empire. The coal was first discovered as early as 1721, but the mines and much of the industrialization started in 1870, when the first railroads started to appear, linking the Donbas region to central Russia and the seaports. Much of the industrialization was financed by British, German, Dutch, and Russian capitalists. By 1871, the Donbas was the highest producer of anthracite coal in the Russian Empire, coming in at about 36% of the total production. And by 1913, the Donbas mines accounted for 87% of all coal production in the Russian Empire. The rapid industrial growth was not without problems, though. Due to the economic instability and the usually poor living and working conditions, there would be multiple strikes and uprisings from the 1890s to the 1910s. Most notably, the 1905 revolution saw workers from Horlivka stage an armed uprising which was brutally crushed by the police and the army. At the outbreak of the First World War, the demand for coal and other resources began to climb, which stimulated new growth in the Donbas region. The war would draw in many immigrant workers and workers from other territories of the Russian Empire to meet the increased demand for resources. During the February Revolution of 1917, many of the workers who were members of the Menshevik and Bolshevik parties banded together with help from paramilitary units from Moscow and established Soviet rule in sections of the Donbas. These sections would change hands between the Bolsheviks and the Army of the Ukrainian National Republic until the establishment of the Ukrainian SSR. During the fighting over the Donbas, most of the industries crumbled and most of the mines were flooded or severely damaged. Coal production fell from 25.3 million tons in 1913 to just 4.6 million tons at the end of the conflict. In the late 1920s, the industrialization was accelerated by the various 5-year plans. The old, damaged mines were rebuilt and new mines were constructed. Coal production rose to 76% of the total production in the USSR by the year 1930. The mining also became less artisanal and more mechanized. By 1937, almost all coal mining in the Donbas was mechanized, and the world's first mechanized combined coal mining and loading machine was invented in Donbas. Along with all of the new coal mines came new thermoelectric stations, with the largest being in Lysychansk. As the Donbas became more industrialized, the population increased, almost doubling from 1926 to 1939. And with the population increase also came a change in the demographics. 64% Ukrainian and 26% Russian in the early 1920s, changed to 61% Ukrainian and 32% Russian by 1939. In 1932 to 33 was an event known today as Holodomor, or death by hunger. This was a state-planned famine that stems from the Stalinist terror and policies of collectivization. Ukraine was the largest grain producer in all of the Soviet Union and was subjected to unreasonably high grain production quotas. The farms were monitored so closely by the state that if anyone was suspected of stealing or eating any grain, they could be arrested or shot. Many often resorted to eating livestock or family pets. It is estimated that about 7 to 10 million died of starvation due to Moscow's policies and the brutal enforcement of those policies. Although the urban areas of the Donbas region were not affected as badly as the rural areas, they were still affected. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, an invasion of the Soviet Union. They swept quickly across the fields and forests of central Ukraine and into the Donbas region. The Germans killed millions of civilians and destroyed much of the infrastructure across all of Ukraine. They intended to make more living space for the German people, make new German colonies, and they deported thousands of Ukrainians to labor camps and factories in other German-occupied territories. The Donbas region was heavily affected. Almost all of the factories and mines were destroyed or flooded, and most of the heavy machinery and equipment was evacuated to the Ural Mountains and would not be returned until after the war. During the 22 months of German occupation, the Donbas suffered an economic loss of an estimated 37 billion rubles at the value of the time. The reconstruction would start immediately and would be completed by 1949, bringing production levels back to the pre-war numbers. The reconstruction would see many mines be modernized and many new mines would be built. The restoration of the Donbas coal mines was so important to the Soviet Union that they awarded a medal to those who participated and achieved outstanding work in doing so. In 1950, the Donbas mines produced 78 million tons of coal, and in 1955 they produced 116 million tons. This massive increase in production is due to the increase of the number of mines from 306 in 1941 to 355 in 1955, and the increased level of modernization and mechanization of the mines. There was also a massive increase of the workforce, from 200,000 in 1940 to 427,000 by 1955, and by 1963 the workforce would be at over 522,000. The mines were also dug deeper, by almost 100 meters every 7 years. The average extraction depth in 1956 was 292 meters, and by 1968 the average depth was 437 meters. The deepest mine was the Kirov mine in Donetsk. It had a max depth of 1,033 meters below ground. And the second deepest, the Bazhanov mine in Makivka, had a max depth of 1,012 meters below ground. In 1967, the Donbas was responsible for almost 30% of all coal mining in the Soviet Union, and the peak of the coal production would be 206 million tons in the year 1976. By 1975, 100% of the cutting was mechanized, 92% of the loading was mechanized, and over 100% of hauling and transportation was mechanized. This degree of mechanization was higher than most coal mines in Western European countries at that time. The most advanced mines in the Donbas could produce as much as 1,805 tons of coal per day, and the workforce had grown to almost 640,000. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was experiencing economic stagnation, as well as transitioning to hydrocarbons and more nuclear energy. This reduced the requirements to mine coal in the Donbas, which was very expensive to mine. By 1985, production had declined to only 20% of the total USSR production. the favor had shifted to more productive and cheaper open-pit mines in Siberia. In 1990, total production from the Donbas mines was 155 million tons, a steep drop from the 206 million tons just 14 years prior. Gorbachev's policy of perestroika also caused many of the Donbas coal workers to strike and protest with the intention of creating a new management system for all of the coal industry that would improve working conditions as well as protect their jobs and economic interests. The policy of glasnost also allowed for the creation of Ukrainian civil organizations that were not under the control of the Communist Party. In turn, these organizations would shed light on crimes committed by Moscow, release information on the Holodomor and casualty counts from the war in Afghanistan. They would also publish Ukrainian-language newspapers and push for further independence. Ukraine would declare independence on August 24th of 1991, and the Soviet Union would collapse on December 31st of the same year. While the country faced a struggling economy, extreme inflation, and trying to keep the separation peaceful, the mines would see extremely rapid declines, with production dropping to 80 million tons by 1995. With the disruption of the communist-planned economy and the newly independent Ukraine reluctant to force market reforms, it plunged Ukraine and the Donbas industrial area into the deepest and longest depression experienced by any of the post-Soviet economies. In the years between 1991 and 1993, Ukraine lost almost 60% of its gross domestic product, and the Donbas was hit the worst, with wages falling over 80% from 1991 to 1993. Many accused Kyiv of neglect and mismanagement. They wanted more localized power and not a new central government. In 1994, the soon-to-be second president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, promised economic revival in the Donbas if he was elected as the next president. This won a lot of votes for him from the Donbas region. With him winning the election and delivering the aid as promised, the Donbas regions began to improve economically. With the new market economy, many of the industries in the Donbas were bought out by oligarchs, the rich and the political elite, largely known for extreme corruption. This was apparent in the whole country, but in the Donbas they were known as the Donets clan. They would influence miners to strike to promote their interests, and they would also gain control of mass media companies to influence people's opinions, and they would eventually found their own political parties. One notable example, Viktor Yushchenko, a coal tycoon, obliged his workers to occasionally pay a full day's pay to fund the growing Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Moscow branch. He himself created 35 churches in towns where he owned enterprises, and these churches were used to promote the Soviet myth that the Donbas was really supporting the whole country, and to nurture the regional political identity. Although Viktor was not the only one to do this, the oligarchs would eventually weed their way into the pockets of local and national government officials, such as Viktor Yanukovych, the governor of Donetsk in 1997. Viktor Yanukovych ran for president in 2004, funded by oil and coal oligarchs from Donbas. He would participate in a rigged election that saw him come out on top, although this fraud set off the Orange Revolution, which caused a recount of the votes, and the election of Yanukovych's opponent, the pro-Ukrainian Viktor Yushchenko. Yushchenko immediately started Ukrainianization of the Donbas. This was not well received by the Donetsk establishment, who saw Ukrainian nationalism as some form of fascism in the typical Soviet fashion. This prompted Yanukovych to seek political support from the Russian Federation. Because of the corruption of the Donbas region, it would be known as a Soviet cesspool, and that was backwards and had thug culture compared to western parts of Ukraine. Coal production started to decline again. Viktor Yanukovych was elected as president in 2010 and started to push forwards with closer ties to the Russian Federation. In 2013 to 14, he continuously refused to proceed with closer ties to the European Union and pushed for more ties with Russia. This caused the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity. which saw citizens protest and resist in the center of Kyiv. Yanukovych cracked down on the protest brutally with Berkut security forces and hired thugs, but this only caused more anger and resistance from the Ukrainian people. The protest would last 94 days and would see dozens of civilian protesters killed by police and snipers. At the end, the coward and Russian puppet Viktor Yanukovych and his delegates would flee to Russia, and Ukraine declared a new temporary president. Following the Maidan Revolution, pro-Russian activists in Crimea and Donbas were secretly curated by Sergei Galazayev to stage protests against the new government and called on the Russian Federation for assistance. Russian volunteers arrived to help seize some key oblast administrations in Crimea, and in the Donbas, the pro-Russian militants led by Russian volunteer Igor Girkin and Alexander Borodai, who were sanctioned by the Kremlin and funded by Russian oligarch Konstantin Malofeev. The separatists took control and declared their Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Anyone who was opposed to their takeover or identified as Ukrainian speakers were terrorized, driven out, or killed. The Ukrainian provisional government, trying to keep the peace and avoid an all-out Russian invasion, declared the Donbas an anti-terrorist operation zone, and quickly dispatched the Ukrainian military and volunteer regiments to drive back the advances of the pro-Russian forces. The war in the Donbas region resulted in significant losses to the military and civilian population and the destruction of most of the Donbas infrastructure. The war collapsed the economy of the region and caused a river of refugees. By the summer of 2016, the Ukrainian Ministry for Social Policy registered up to 1.8 million internally displaced people inside Ukraine, and another 1 million fled the conflict zone towards the Russian Federation. Thus, coal production declined by nearly 80%, mainly as a result of the loss of mines to the Russian-controlled DPR and LPR. Unemployed coal miners now earn wages by serving in the DPR and LPR military. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a massive invasion into Ukraine on multiple fronts: west from the LPR and DPR, north from Crimea, and south from Belarus. The Kremlin declared it a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, as well as protect the DPR and LPR from the so-called genocide at the hands of Ukraine. While these accusations are blatantly false and the war is very real, the massacres of the Kyiv region, the occupation of the south, and the shifting lines in the east have destroyed hundreds of important infrastructure objects and killed thousands of civilians, and the Donbas has seen some of the most intense and destructive combat. It can be assumed that most coal mines that were at one point on contested territory are severely damaged or destroyed, as well as the cities and towns around them. The amount of utter destruction caused by this war of Russian aggression hasn't been seen since the Second World War. While the outcome of this war is unpredictable at this time, I can say with some confidence that most of the coal mines and other important infrastructure objects that are in Russian-controlled territory currently will be completely destroyed or damaged beyond repair if and when Ukraine reclaims the occupied territory. Lastly, there are some reports of the Russian government illegally exporting stolen coal from the few still operating mines and shipping it into Russia. Although these reports are not confirmed to my knowledge, and probably never will be officially confirmed by the Russian government, it is safe to say that stealing natural resources is completely within the realm of activities conducted by the Russian Federation. It is hard to say whether these old mines will ever be used again, or if they will be lost to time and forgotten. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope you liked it or found it interesting. If so, please like and subscribe to help grow the channel, and so that I can continue to produce more interesting videos. Thank you.